Okay, welcome back. In this tutorial, we are going to deal with the constant. So click this button, and here is the constant. And these are quite obvious. But I forgot one thing is the template doesn't have power. Actually, multiple type Lumina character have 4000 power. You can add one line, it's called power. And this air juggle is a gameplay safety mechanism. Basically, it prevents you to do an endless combo. Another two thing I want to mention is the int persist index and the float persist index. So the one value, the int value is 60 and the float is 40. It means it will preserve all the integer and the float variables between rounds. Okay, you can choose to erase it or keep it. If you change these two values, that means the integer variable or float variable will be forced cleared to 0 between rounds. And this X scale and Y scale, we talked about it in previous tutorial. I will not talk it in this one. And last time we decided the 1.1 is a better value for this Saber compared to my roster. And this ground front and ground back is the pivot point to your front foot and the rear foot. We can measure it in this way. Okay, you just click animation and make sure the X and Y offsets are at 0. So you put into the front foot and check your X value. Okay, and the reading is 80 something, minus 80. So when you key in the value, you need to flip the sign. Minus 80 will be plus 80. Okay. Oh, I made a mistake. The front is 80. And let's measure the back. So the back is 90 something. So the back is, the reading is plus 90. And same thing goes to the air back and air front, but we will use a different picture for reference. So for the ground, we are using enemy number 0, right? Make sure now you revert back to 0 for XY offsets. And for the air one, we will use the jump animation, okay, which is 41. We are going to do the same and measure the front and the back. So the front is 48 something. Okay. The back 60 or something, 61. And revert back to 0. Okay. And we can use the same trick to measure the height. Okay. Let's go back to enemy 0, which is the standing. And let's do the same thing. Now the Y offset reading is 350 something. 350. And this will be the height. And next one is the attack the distance. So this is for Kung Fu Man actually. But Saber have a sword, so the attack distance should be longer than a bare hand, right? So I give it a bigger number. So projectile attack distance, I also give it a bigger number. Does the projectile do scare? I say yes. Yeah, say yes. But we barely use this kind of constants. So the head ports XY and the mid port XY, you can measure the coordinate using the same trick that we measure the front and back. So you can go to the animation. So you put on the face, put the pivot point on the face, and remember this XY. But for this one, remember to reverse the sign, okay? Negative you go positive, and the positive you become negative. Okay, reverse the sign, okay? And same for middle parts. So the reading is 200 something, and remember to flip the sign. Maybe we just give 0. Okay, I think this science part is done. And for the walk forward or walk back, you see the current walking speed for Saber is actually a bit too fast. I remember her walking speed is very slow actually. This is too fast. So I decided to give it a small value. And I remember Saber's run is relatively very fast than other Mugen character, but currently is too slow. So I may give her a bigger one. This actually double the speed. The run back is the dash back. Actually, this is quite okay. Maybe give it a bigger value. And jump neutral, and here is jump neutral. Actually it's quite okay. Oh, so I cannot jump over. I believe either I jump too low or the opponent is, the height is too high. Okay, let's give it a bigger value, minus 44, and the minus for vector is go up. Okay, wow, too much. This is too much. Maybe minus 36. Shift F4 to reload. Okay. But another player 2 is too high. So Saber now the setting is too high. Even this is the measured one. So I decide maybe this is not very practical. I lower the height, and you see the description. This is for opponent to jump over. So even I give it a value is not correct, but it's more practical. Okay, you see now it's more easy to jump over. And let's copy the value to jump forward and jump back for the Y one. And let's see, we should change the jump forward and jump back. Maybe we give it a little bit bigger value. So which value you give is totally depend on you. Since you are not making an accurate character, you can give whatever value you want. And for these parts, if you don't know what are these, you just leave it, don't change it. And later we may have to deal with it, but now no. For movement parts, actually air jump, the air jump is the system, is the Mugen default air jump. Maybe you will not like it. Maybe you will make a custom system for the air jump. Now click the default one looks like this. And the y axle is y acceleration, basically is the gravity value. So if you give it 2, I think it will not change dramatically. It's still like this. You can still jump over. And the remaining part you can probably ignore first. We may deal it later if you really want to increase your character quality. This is the wing quote. Okay, you see there's 2 languages of wing quotes. One is the default language, one is the Japanese one. So if the character version is above 1.0, you can support multi-language. I can even add one more language. Since I'm a Chinese, I can add a Chinese wing quotes. So it's really depend on your Mugen.cfg settings. So if your Mugen CFG says it's in English, and the English one will be displayed. If you set to Japanese, which is JA, the Japanese one will be displayed. If I set to Chinese, which is the ZH one, the Chinese one will be displayed. Okay, the following will be quite advanced, but for Saber, her sword is important, right? She cannot be called as a Saber without a sword. So I will try to add the sword. Compared to other characters, this Saber certainly will be more complicated, and she have to sync with her sword. Maybe I don't have type Lumina yet, but I have this game. In this game, this Saber also has a sword, but it's separate from the master character. Until now, this game is quite old. Until now, nobody made this Saber yet. But the only guess is it's too complicated to make it. So in order to add a sword, I decided to add a helper, and a helper is actually a character. So basically you can summon another character and as your helper, but this helper will not run standard animation or crouch animation, but the character will dedicate to run the sword animation. Okay, so let me copy one file and make a helper.cns, and I will add this helper.cns to saber.def. Basically this helper.cns is copied from moves.cns, and I will make the sword states in the helper.cns. And let's copy some basic definitions of a state. Let's, for example, state 200. Let's copy it to help.cns. Okay, this is a player's help. This is a comment. Let's paste in the state definition. I will rename the 200 to 10,000. Okay, so 10,000 is exclusive to source, the Excalibur. And the type is this player is either standing or crouching or in air. Actually, it doesn't matter because this is not a player. Okay. And move type is idle. And the physics will be N, which means no physics. So no physics means you can control your gravity, you can ignore the friction, and juggle. This states doesn't need the juggle, and the control will be 0. It's not controllable. And this faucet, we can comment it out. It doesn't have any velocity, and it will not have any animation to begin with. The animation will depend on the parent's animation. Okay. And here is the sprite's priority. The higher priority will display in front of lower priority sprites. Okay, so every state will need at least one code block, or I should say state controller. Let's just say states 10,000 change animation. And a state controller is, let's go to the official document. And you say state controller reference and a trigger list. So the state controller we will use is change anime. Okay. Basically, change anime is the controller to play a animation. Okay. So we will say, we will make a comment again. This states is for the sword Excalibur. And actually my voice is dubbed, so actually I misspelled Excalibur. It's B-U-R, not B-E-R. So let's say this controller type is change anime. Okay. And every controller need at least one trigger. Okay, so we say trigger 1, and when to trigger. If you want it trigger every seconds, every tick, you just say 1. 1 is always trigger. And the game is running at 60 FPS, and means it will trigger 60 times per second. And the value is which anime we will play. So we made a rule that the sword animation will be parent's anime number plus 10k. So we take parent anime number plus 10k. Okay. And the elements of this animation. So every animation will have frame numbers. So for example, frame 1 you play how many tick, frame 2 you play how many tick. And this frame number I also made the sword same as the root or the parents. So to get the element number of a animation, you can use this trigger. Return the number of animation element in current action that will be displayed in specific time. And this 0 means now. Okay. And so basically take the parent anime element now which is the current animation element number. And we will also give this ignore hit pause equals to 1. Every state you can give 2 additional universal attribute or property, which is persistent or ignore hit pause. So why we need it is when our parent, which is Saber, hit something, we don't want the help to wait for a hit pause. Okay? We want the help to be stick to the parent all the time. And maybe we can refine our trigger. Okay, we can do a trigger or, which is we can say we can do a check whether the sword have the animation or not. So we say animation exists. You can ask this animation exists or not, because some animation the sword doesn't exist. For example, the parent is being thrown by enemy, and this will be a random animation number created by the enemy, and the sword doesn't have a corresponding animation, so it will end up in error. So we can do a check first whether the animation exists or not. So we can also say the trigger 1 is not triggered every time to save some of our CPUs. Basically, we are saying when the parent animation plus 10k is not equals to our current animation. So basically means the enemy is not in sync. And we can also say trigger 2, the parent anime element number, which is this one, is not equal to our is the sword element number. That means if the element number is not in sync or the animation number is not in sync, let's change the animation. Okay, I think this is quite decent already. Another thing we want to do is make sure the sword is always on Saber's hand. So we can use this state controller. It's called a bind to parent. So we say type is bind to parent. And trigger will be 1, I guess. A times 1. Facing if set to 1 is face the same direction as the parent. If -1 is facing the opposite. And parts, the sword will have the same coordinate number as the parent. And we add one trigger, which is 1, always bind to parent. And also we add ignore hit pause and make sure it will not affect by the hit pause. Maybe you see what the difference between bind to parent and bind to roots. And when your helper is a helper's helper, then you say bind to root. So if you have a helper, then you need to think when to destroy this helper. A destroy helper means make it disappear instantly. There's no explosion, no hits. Disappear instantly, okay? So currently we can say this sword is always there. And you don't need to delete it. And this recursive and remove explode I set to 1. Recursive means if the sword Excalibur summon another helper, the child helper will be deleted. And currently I cannot think a reason to delete the sword, so I maybe say 0. Okay, let's check.
Round 1, fight.
And you see the Saber still doesn't have any sword yet, because we just coded the helper, but we never executed the code or never summoned the helper. Okay, so we will try to create this helper and then let this helper use the code from helper.cns, and we are going to add a controller in maybe state definition -3, okay, or in state definition -2. The difference, so -2, -3, and -1 are a universal state. It's not like state 0 or state 20 or state 200. It will be run in every frame. So the difference is state -2 will always run. State -3, it will not run when you are being thrown. So let's put a controller under -2. Let's say create sword Excalibur. And we are going to check the document. And this will be the helper state controller. Okay, helper. Let's say type equals helper. And let's give it a trigger. You cannot say 1, because if you say 1, it will create helper in every tick of your second. If 1 second have 60 frame tick, then it will create 60 Excalibur in this in this game. Okay. So I will say trigger 1 is game time. Maybe make sure it will not create this sword when the time is 0. And then we can add another restriction like if the sword is not being created, something like that. We can say number of helper. This is a trigger, and 10,000 is equals to 0, means that this helper Excalibur is not exist yet. Then we check the game time is not is have some number which is not 0. Then we create this sword. Then this will avoid create this Excalibur always creating the swords. Always creating means every second you create 60 of them, and your computer will running out of resource very soon. And we can also see we didn't want to create this sword when the state number is 9500, which is the initial state, initialization state, and the state is not 190. 190 is the pre-intro state. It's also a step of initialization. Okay, now we can specify the parameters for this helper. So the helper type will be normal. Actually, there's another type, it's called player. So if it's a normal, then your enemy will not able to sense this existence of this helper unless he or she do some tricks. If it's a player, then it will sense the existence of this helper. Please give this helper an ID, and I will say ID is 10,000, same as the state number. Okay. You can also say exclamation mark, number of helper 10,000. It means no helper 10,000, which is equals to 0. And what the helper is going to run, which part of the code is going to run, is this part, state 10,000. So the previous one is the ID number. The following one is the state number, where the code is located. These two doesn't have to be the same. And ports and ports type. Let's do the ports type first. The ports type will be definitely P1, which means player 1, means the current player, and P2 means your enemy. And ports will be 0 and 0. We are taking the same position. And the next parameter will be facing. I guess it will be 1. 1 will means face the same direction as the parent. Next, we already covered this key control. Key control is 0. So if key control is 1, that means the helper can sense your key input. And on POW, which means if, for example, your powlet changes, the helper will be affected or not. I say 1, it will not be affected. And remap POW, we currently doesn't need it. We can comment this thing out. And here is the super move time. This one means when your enemy or yourself is using some time stop mechanism, for example super move time stop, the help will able to move inside this time stop period. Okay, so actually I want the help to move all the time regardless the time stop things. So I will give it a ridiculous big number and make sure the help is always running. It will not be stopped by any time stop mechanism. So I will give it a 4 bytes. Okay. This is a 4 byte. And this is the number of 4 byte convert to decimal. Okay. I will give it this ridiculous big number and make sure it can run all the time. And if you convert to minutes, this is the result. And size X scale and size Y scale is important for us. I will explain later. I will just take the default number 1 and you will see what the impact if you didn't give this a proper number. And let's use Shift F4 to reload the game. And now you see we have the sword, but the sword is a little bit off place, right? And that's because we are using a sprite scale. So the root character, which is the parent, which is the Saber, is using 1.1 scale, but your sword is still using 1. So means the sword is smaller than the character. So they need to use the same scale factor. So if you say 1.1 for the sword and refresh, yeah, it will be at the correct place. Okay. But it's not good to say 1.1 here, because if you change the root, you have to change here. So there is a trigger is called the const, which can pull the constant of a player. So there is a trigger that says const size x scale. So we can use this trigger size x scale. So basically this code will pull out the root settings for x scale. Okay, so you don't have to set to 1.1, and this will be y scale, and it will take out the root settings. If root change to 1.2, here also will be changed to 1.2. And from now on, if you saw this kind of scale, position, vectors, or speed, you all multiply by const x scale and the y scale. So this will make sure all your position or your speed or vector is in a correct value.
Round 1. Fight.
You see, now we have the sword, but something wrong, right? You see, the sword is still there when the sword doesn't have the animation of a Kung Fu Man kick, right? We don't have sword that doesn't have a corresponding animation for this Kung Fu Man's kick. So the sword never sync up with it. So we can now sync a reason to kill the sword, to delete this sword. Also we can say counter. And what the counter is, I will use a var, a variable, I should say. You saw a var add, and the trigger for var add is maybe 1, always add. And add what is var 6. In every tick of tick is a time unit for Mugen. Basically, 60 FPS is tick 60 times in 1 second. So I will add var 6 for every tick. And take this ridiculous number. So if the sword is staying there for too long, okay, staying here for too long, basically the counter is greater than this ridiculous number. That means it's too long. It's possible you have something like a memory overflow or something, or variable overflow or something, I don't know. So you kill this sword. Another reason we can kill the sword is the sword cannot have a corresponding animation to the parent. So when the sword doesn't have an animation to play, let's kill the sword.
Fight.
Reload, and let's see. You see, when there's an invalid enemy, for the sword, it will not being displayed. Another trick I can tell you is when you're in training mode, something wrong here. You see the sword is behind the player, so that means the sprite's priority is not enough. Let's increase the sword sprite's priority, and you see the attack sprite's priority, which is 200, is 2, and let's make the sword 2 also. So let's see who will win. Clearly the sword win. Now the sword is in front of the player. Okay. And you may ask how I can stop the animation, stop the game. Basically, if you are in training mode, you can hit this pause button. It's only available on the full keyboard, and you can use the scroll lock to advance frame one by one. And let me show you the remap. So let's force remap the sword to use 1 and 1 powerlet. So 1 and 1 powerlet will be player 1 powerlet. Basically, the Dark Saber we're using player 1's sword. We're using the normal Excalibur. Okay. Let's comment it out. Then the sword we're using the same powerlet as the root player. And it looks normal now. And if you saw the original game, I will show you some footage of the original game. It looks like this. So you see the sword can be hidden and can be shown. And when it's hidden, actually it looks like this. Actually, it's a 3D model. It's very difficult to recreate this kind of effect in Mugen. But it's possible, not impossible. So maybe you say, let's make the sword transparent. Can. There is a state controller to make the player become transparent. And let's see. And then of course, the player, is the sword. There's a controller called trans. Type trans. And the trigger will be maybe the 1. Always transparent. And let's take the value, a trans type. Trans type in 1.1 always use add or none or sub. Don't use the add 1 and add alpha. And the alpha value is the values you determine how transparent the player is. So if we say 256 and 0, it means opaque. It's just like nothing. It's just like you never applied this transparency. Okay, so let's reload. It should take no effect. Yeah, so if you say 256 and 256, it will be looks like this.
Round 1.
Okay. This is called color add. Basically, it will calculate pixel by pixel. And so if we want a transparent, semi-transparent, we change the first number. We halve the first number, it will be looks like this. If the first number is 0 and the last number is 256, it will be completely transparent and not able to see. And then we can even make the sword blink. What do I mean blink? Is basically you take a time period. For example, we take 0 to or 1 to 22 or 32 maybe. So we decide 0 to 15 is dark to bright, and 16 to 32 is bright to dark. So it will be in a cycle. So we need to have two transparent controller. One is dark to bright, and another is bright to dark. I will not explain this one in this tutorial because this is not for beginner. Reload. It looks like this. But can we actually achieve the original games effect? It is possible. You see, when I download this Saber sprites, I saw this kind of this is not sprites, this is texture. Actually, this is texture for a 3D model. The sword in original game actually is kind of a 3D model and applied with this kind of texture. So it's quite hard to do, but it's not completely impossible. And let me do a proof of concept. I actually ripped those texture and make into Mugen sprites. Okay, it looks like this. Okay, and now I will also make a animation for this kind of mist and the line of the sword. It looks like this. And I decide to fix the transparency of the sword by using a very low value, so it can be barely see. It looks like this. So I will use another state controller, is explode, and explode is not only for explode, it's actually for display a picture. So let's say trigger. For example, this explode is not being created yet, and let's give a exclamation mark, means this thing doesn't exist yet, and we will create this explode. And the explode have required parameters, for example animation, and we'll using the animation of the explode, and ID will be the same as the animation. And this space is Mugen 1.1 special. So basically, if you say space is screen, then the picture will not be scaled by zoom or moved by the stage. It will not follow the stage, it will follow the screen. And if you say the stage, that means anything inside on the stage will be affected by the zoom, will affect by camera moving. And this bind ID is to say the explode will bind to who. And the equals ID means the ID will give back the current player's ID. And the current player is one 10,000, which is the sword. And we give the pose 00 first, and you will see the result later. And from now on, any position, vector, and scale, please add this constant size x scale. So make sure it will end up in the correct position, even it's 0. And facing, let's say facing is 1. Actually, facing is 1 is not correct, and this explanation is kind of misleading. And bind time -1 means always bind. And velocity means the picture you show will have a speed or not. We were not using any velocity. Remove time. Remove time is -1, means never remove the scene. And super pause time and hit pause time, let's give it a very big number. Make sure it will not affect by the super pause or hit pause. And scale, of course, the scale will take constant x scale and a constant y scale. And scale use the constant x scale and a constant y scale. So angle is 0 for now. Okay, let's reload and see.
Round 1, fight.
Now you saw the scene, but it's behind the player. So we will add another parameter, which is can change the sprite's priority. Yeah, SPR priority. And let's add somewhere. Now the sword itself is 3, and we are going to add it 4, so it will in front of the sword.
Fight.
Okay. Now you saw it. Now the position is 0, 0, not here, right? We hope the position is on the sword, of course. So how we change the position? If you remember, the trick we use to measure for example, the height, the mid pause or the head pause. So we go to the sword animation, corresponding animation to standing. Okay, let's drag this animation and make sure here is 0, 0. Drag to the desired place, okay, which is these two numbers, and you need to remember to flip these two numbers sign. Positive need to go negative and negative need to go positive. Okay. And revert back to 0 and change the position of this explode and flip the sign. Okay, save.
Round 1.
And you see for player 1 it ended up in correct position, and for player 2 is flipped. So we added a facing trigger in the X position. So when facing is facing to the right, it will be 1. If facing to the left, it will be -1. So then we add in both are in correct place. The next thing is angle. Maybe let's try 100 degrees.
Round 1. Fight.
Still a bit off. Maybe another value. This is try and error.
Round 1. Fight.
Maybe one more degree is good enough. I don't know. You see, this facing parameter is kind of not clear. Actually, facing equals to 1 means this explode will always facing to the right. If it's -1 means it will always facing to the left. Okay, -1, I mean the player one side will be wrong. Then how we can fix this? Because we want this facing the same direction as the player, which is the sword. So you know we have a trigger called facing. So facing equals facing means it will check the player's facing value. If it's facing to the right, then it's 1. Facing to the left, and then it's -1. So it will be dynamic. Now it looks right. Now we will copy the explode and add another one. It's called sword mist.
Round 1. Fight.
Maybe it's too big. I can scale it down.
Round 1. Fight.
And now it is like this, and it's kind of right, but there's no way you can compete with the original game since it's a 3D model. And now you see we only made one frame of this sword's invisible effect. And how many frames this sword have, then you know how difficult to make this kind of effect. So basically you are going to make hundreds of different states of this kind of mists. For example, you have to tweak the angle, tweak the position, and tweak the length, the width. So it's a huge amount of work. Okay, if you liked my video, please subscribe. Thank you for watching.